Back in the late 90s, all the way until the early 2010s, Sony was practically the king of console gaming. From a booming start with the PlayStation and the numerous big games it hosted, to the inclusion of a DVD player within the PS2, it seemed like Sony was making every correct decision to indicate a successful gaming company. While consoles like the PlayStation 3, 4, and even 5 were successful to some extent, it was at this time where Sony had garnered a little more of a negative reputation among the wider gaming community. I'm sure you've all heard the PlayStation 5 has no games jokes that fly around Twitter every time something big happens with the console. And it doesn't help that a hero shooter that Sony poured over $100 million into lasted all of 2 weeks on the market. But it seems that Sony's position as the #1 gaming console manufacturer has come into question, especially with the success of the Nintendo Switch. Earlier this month, a brand new original game was released for the PS5, Astro Bot, and people are loving it. Simply by playing it, you can feel the passion poured into the game by the developers, how they work to make it a fun, low-stakes experience that you can just have a good time with. Now that the game is out and is performing exceptionally well with audiences, it's gotten me to think about a lot of the IPs that Astro Bot chose to pay homage to. For those who don't know, Astro Bot is a puzzle platforming game that sees you, Astro Bot, running around different planets and saving the different bot characters who flew out of your PlayStation 5 ship when it crash landed. Among these bot characters are cameos to many of Sony's numerous IPs over the company's history. Characters like Parappa the Rapper, Spyro, and even something as niche as Loco Roco gets referenced. While the game serves as a bit of a celebration for Sony's storied history within the games market, these cameos also kind of highlight how poorly Sony has managed a ton of these series. With the launch of the PlayStation 5 came a different mindset when producing games. Gone were the days of super mixed catalogs where you had incredibly silly, cost-effective games alongside big-budget thrillers. With the success of series such as Uncharted and The Last of Us, companies honed in on the super serious, multi-million-dollar budget games that were more focused on narrative. And while I could talk about how this great shift impacted the gaming medium as a whole, I kind of just want to focus on what it did to a lot of Sony's smaller IPs, and what their inclusion in Astro Bot could tell us about the future. Among one of the first planets you'll visit in Astro Bot is an entire world themed around the game Ape Escape. Ape Escape was one of Sony's more niche franchises on the PlayStation 1 and 2, and is best described as a game where you platform through these zany worlds using gadgets to catch some mischievous monkeys. While it might not carry a narrative like some of Sony's other IPs, it was just an incredibly fun game that even spawned 2 sequels. Despite the game not necessarily being one that would entice super serious action-driven gamers, the first game alone sold over 600,000 copies, with the sequels being no slouch either. The third game was even featured in Metal Gear Solid 3, possibly Sony's biggest IP at the time, as a secret mission where you have to prevent a group of specially trained gorilla apes from using a Metal Gear weapon. I'm not gonna sit here and say that Ape Escape has the biggest fan base of all time. Even on these older consoles, it was still a bit niche to some extent. And it seems that's why Sony chose to essentially abandon the franchise upon the release of the PlayStation 3 and 4. But with Astro Bot featuring an entire world based around the whole concept of the Ape Escape series, they might be willing to put out a new game. Upon my first playthrough of the game, I posted on Twitter how this world showcases exactly why we need another Ape Escape game. Something low stakes that won't cost hundreds of millions of dollars to produce. But Ape Escape isn't the only series featured in Astro Bot that falls into this cheaper to produce, overall fun game category. Other abandoned Sony staples such as Sly Cooper, Parappa the Rapper, Jak and Daxter, Klonoa. It's not a good sign when I have a literal list of these characters that Sony's forgotten about, are all featured as cameo bots within the game. Do you know how crazy it was to hop on Twitter and have people spoil that Sony is finally acknowledging a lot of their old series? Some of these being series that helped them get as big as they are now. It seems now that Sony is only willing to fund and support AAA series like God of War, The Last of Us, and Horizon. While that hasn't seemed to fail for them yet, it makes the overall content library for their console a lot more uniform and lackluster, since those are the big three that they're really pushing out. They even forgot about Sackboy, who was essentially the mascot for the PlayStation in the 7th and 8th generations. Little Big Planet was not niche by any stretch of the imagination. The series has sold over 10 million copies worldwide. So why didn't Sony push to put one of these games on the PS5? Matter of fact, why didn't they push to retain the rights to a ton of series that once defined their consoles? Some of the biggest games that fall into this category of Sony negligence are Spyro and Crash Bandicoot. Essentially Sony's input on the platforming debate going on between Mario and Sonic. For the longest time, these games were exclusive to PlayStation consoles. But with each series' respective collection of classic games, they both went multi-platform. While I understand that Sony has no control over what a separate company does with their own IP, they could have at least made an effort to retain them. Even outside of these lower stake games, Sony really crapped the bed with series like Metal Gear Solid and Devil May Cry. Metal Gear was the reason why a ton of people purchased the original PlayStation. A game with a story and cinematography on par with a lot of movies, that also had meaningful commentary on the world around it. While it was ultimately Konami's poor handling of the series that led to its demise, Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain was the first game in the series to go multi-platform, so Sony somehow lost the rights to their biggest series in the early 2000s. Devil May Cry also served as an entry point for a lot of people with the PlayStation 2. Even after the failure that was Devil May Cry 2, the series picked up a lot of steam after the third entry, which many consider to be the best in the series. As my good friend Kyler360 pointed out in his video on the Xbox 360, Devil May Cry made its way onto the Xbox with the release of Devil May Cry 4. While it's owned by Capcom and has gone through a plethora of changes recently, Astro Bot gave us the first new piece of Devil May Cry content, outside of the mobile gacha game, in 5 years. The 7th generation of consoles seemingly led to a lot of developers deciding to go multi-platform with their games. But what could have caused this? I would argue that the 7th generation of consoles is where the idea of console-exclusive games started to die out. I guess developers either exhausted their contracts with Sony or decided that it'd be far more worth it to release their games to a wider audience. Grand Theft Auto, the Batman Arkham series, and Call of Duty were undoubtedly some of the biggest games out there, and being on multiple consoles helped a lot more than it hurt. So I can only assume that developers who used to have exclusive deals with Sony followed in these series' footsteps, releasing to multiple consoles. Sony was only really able to hold on to a few IPs, but they really honed in on The Last of Us and Uncharted, both series being AAA titles that most certainly cost a lot to produce. And you can even see this today. Outside of Astro's Playroom and Astro Bot, what is the newest Sony IP? It's Horizon, another large-scale, resource-heavy AAA title. But Astro's Playroom is reminding people of the plethora of games that got them into the PlayStation in the first place. Sony has a ton of old series at their fingertips that wouldn't be as big as games like The Last of Us, but would undoubtedly draw a large player base and be worth the investment. Stuff like a new Parappa the Rapper game, which would undoubtedly bring rhythm fans to the PlayStation 5, A new Sly Cooper game, Suikoden, Ape Escape, Wipeout. There are so many genres that Sony could tap into, but ignore since they won't bring the same attention as their big games. I will say, I'm thankful that they held on to some of the newest Final Fantasy releases. The remakes of 7 and 16 are all good games, but since the PlayStation 5 doesn't have the library to entice more people to pick it up, the Final Fantasy games have to get ported to PC in order to get the audience they deserve. Sega's been in kind of a similar position. For the longest time in the mid-2000s and 2010s, all they made was Sonic, and outside of that, they were publishing far more successful series such as Persona and Yakuza. But last year, Sega announced that they would be reviving some of their old IPs that made the Saturn and Dreamcast iconic, as much as those consoles failed. Crazy Taxi, Jet Set, even Golden Axe all seem to be making a return now that Sonic and Persona basically held the company up for over a decade. As much as Sony CEOs say that they don't have enough IPs to warrant making new games, Astro Bot is proving them wrong, literally showing off how much Sony has in the vault, and how poorly they've prioritized certain games over the past decade. If Sony decides to be smart and revisit these properties, be it new games, remakes, or even just a simple port, I'm almost certain that people will take notice and appreciate that the PlayStation 5 actually has a wide variety of games spanning different genres, rather than sticking to 2 or 3 AAA story-driven games where the camera is always positioned behind the player's back. Let's hope that Astro Bot isn't the last time that we'll see a lot of these characters, because it's opened new players' eyes as to how much potential Sony has across a ton of different genres. It's just up to them to take advantage of it, and hopefully not pour a 9-digit figure into a hero shooter that does nothing to differentiate itself from others within the genre before shutting it down after only 2 weeks. Start releasing smaller scale games that aren't supposed to be taken seriously, but can help push software out the door and maybe even convince people to pick up the console simply based on how many notable titles there are outside of AAA stuff. It's not an insane business model. I can't believe it cost $315 million to make Spider-Man 2, as good as it was. No one's gonna play it if you don't have a list of titles to convince people to buy your console. God, it's like I could almost run this company better. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in my next video where I actually talk about one of the series mentioned today. I'll let you figure out which one.